Hi, I'm Ben.
And I'm Carl.
And you're listening to Secret Sonics. Honest conversations chock full of tactical advice to help you build your dream career in music and audio.
Whether it's skill development, mixing mindsets, personal branding, or work-life balance, we talk about ways to help set yourself up for success in the ever-changing music industry.
Let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome back to Secret Sonics. This is the first part of our conversation with mixing engineer Matt Huber. Matt was previously on the podcast back on episode 191 when it was just me. And in this episode, Carl and I get nerdy and discuss all things loudness with Matt, including why brightness, not just compression, plays a crucial role in perceived loudness on streaming, the unexpected impact of vocal, kick, and snare levels on how loud a track feels, how Spotify's normalization changes based on playlist context, strategies for communicating with clients about loudness without compromising mix quality. We also talk about genre-specific loudness targets that help maintain musical impact and excitement, and so much more. So with all that to say, here's part one of our conversation with Matt Huber coming up right here on Secret Sonics.
Hi, Ben. Hi, Matt.
Hi. Nice to be with you guys again.
Hi, everyone. Yes. Thanks for coming back on the pod.
I'm just absolutely pleased to be here.
So, okay, I'm gonna force this conversation right into something that you really piqued my interest right before we started recording. I don't know. I am not a technical person in general. Like, yes, I am a mixing engineer, and that's how I pay my mortgage. But like the real nitty gritty of the science behind it is a bit of a mystery to me always. And something that you mentioned before we started recording was that you're saving noise profiles and that you have like a metric butt ton of noise profiles. And I have no idea what you're talking about. And I want to know what you're talking about, because if you're doing it, Mr. Huber, clearly it's something important. So I would love to. Oh yeah,
noise profiles. It's the difference between a good and a great mix. Am I right?
It's like dithering, right?
Yeah. I mean, well, I use
a little bit more than dithering.
Yeah, a little more. I use Isotope RX a lot, and it's just like as mix engineers, we get in all various sorts of tracks, and a lot of our job is problem solving. So, we've all been in that situation where you've got an electric guitar track or a DI electric track or a bass track or a Juno or something, and it's got noise in it that is distracting in quieter sections or whatever. And so I always find, reach for Isotope spectral denoise, and it's like sometimes I could get it, but sometimes you don't have that like isolated moment of noise that you can take it from. So I just started like saving noise profiles from typical noisy things. So, like there'll be, maybe a studio that I know a lot of people are cutting drums in, the noise floor there, or the ever-present Juno chorus hiss, and having basically those noise profiles in my pocket so that when I encounter situations like that, it's easier to clean it up. Sometimes you can capture that noise. Sometimes I can just go through my profile of saved noise profiles to be able to attack just cleaning up tracks. The most exciting part of mixing, of course.
Always. No, that's awesome. Okay, so it's basically kind of, in a way, like future-proofing your cleanup in a way, because that way when you get tracks, especially if you're working with the same producers, the same artists who are recording in the same studio or same home studio, especially if you're doing like a full-length album, like, okay, well, there's one song that has a nice bit of electrical hum on the Strat. I'm going to save that, and now I can apply that. That's really smart.
Yeah, just a little lifesaver. Kind of fun.
Yeah, just like smart planning. It's like, we always go through these things where like they repeat themselves, there's all these cycles within the work we do. So just once you see that it's a pattern and it repeats itself, you just kind of, okay, the buck stops here. Let's go.
Right, right.
How many times did you want to throw your computer against the wall until you realized, oh, I should start saving these for the future? Like, you know what I mean? Like, how many times have you pained over not being able to find an isolated section until you had that one day where it just clicked for you?
Well, I think it was like kind of what you referred to earlier. I kind of stumbled upon it because like I was mixing a live record one time and I was just running into the same problem of noise on specific tracks. And then it just occurred to me, I was like, oh, well, I've got this isolated section in another song. I'll just save that and apply it to other things. And it was just sort of a thing that I started doing. I was like, well, I'll just keep these in my back pocket. Who knows? They might be handy. And so I kind of like accidentally got into doing it. But yeah, it's just been a lifesaver.
That's great.
I'm able to like when I do a RX profile, you could have like the smallest little cycle and just loop it, and it's usually good enough.
Yeah, exactly. Like 10 milliseconds.
Cool. Thanks for answering that very specific question that I got.
Very, very niche.
But I got like irrationally excited about it, and that doesn't happen often about technical things. So, so we can call out the elephant in the room and say, "Wow, that was that's all we got to talk about for
All right, well,
noise
see you guys
noise
later.
profiles." Thanks, Matt. Thanks for being here. Now we can aggressively just change the topic because
Let's do it.
So let's talk about Loudness, Spotify, getting things to really like cut through the mix. Actually, I don't know if it was one of your mixes today, but I was just like listening to a mix that was so loud. And then I turned on another mix and it was so soft. And I was like, whoa, this is just like, it's crazy. The variations of things. Actually, the truth is I turned off my normalization on Spotify because I think it degrades the sound. But I guess it's still sort of a thing, trying to compete with Loudness. What are your thoughts these days? Or maybe even what has changed since we last spoke when you're thinking about getting things to really poke through, even if everything else is at -8, -7.
Yeah, for sure. So I would kind of give a lot of the credit to this conversation to a mastering engineer I work with. His name is Sam Moses. He's been doing a podcast with another mastering engineer for many, many years. He's really done a lot of deep diving into what happens when you upload to these DSPs, what happens to the audio, and also figuring out, they started doing this whole loudness normalization thing, and people kind of freaked out and like, oh, what does this mean? Some people are like, oh, it means you need to turn your stuff in at -14 or you get a loudness penalty. And then other people were just like, screw it, I don't care. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. But he really kind of was just trying to dismantle like what's going on behind the scenes here. And so that kind of like piqued my interest in it initially. And then another piece to the puzzle was this year iZotope released RX11, which had something called streaming preview in it, where they figured out what these different DSPs were doing to your audio when you upload it. And then they created essentially different presets in the plugin to be able to be like, all right, well, let's say you're using Spotify and the quality setting is here and the normalization setting is here. What's going to happen to your audio? And so those two things kind of came together and coalesced into a record what I was working on with Sam. He was mastering for very loud record, hardcore record with a really great producer, Dane and Rector producing. And we were all just like, we just want to go down every path possible to make sure that this record comes across the way we want it to on streaming. Well, really on all mediums, streaming, digital download, so on and so forth. And so we just kind of obsessed over it. And the iZotope RX11 streaming preview was really helpful in just kind of decoding what makes a song loud, what happens, if you upload something that's like, -5 integrated versus -10 integrated, like what's going on here? And how do you, I don't know if the right word is how do you game it, but how can you be aware of what's happening and approach your mix decisions and mastering decisions accordingly? So that was kind of like the beginning of the journey. And throughout the course of this project, we were just trying to learn lessons of how should we think about this going forward. And I think it's funny because it answered some questions and didn't answer some questions. It was like we didn't really end up coming away with like, oh, we figured out the algorithm necessarily, but we did figure some things out. So in terms of loudness, so just to kind of top level of this whole thing, what loudness should I, integrated LUFS or however you're measuring things, what should I upload at? Well, the answer is it depends. It depends on a lot of things. One of the things we learned was when you're uploading to Spotify, louder doesn't always mean louder, and quieter doesn't always mean louder, and quieter doesn't always mean quieter. It really, what it confirmed for us is the first thing is you should not make your loudness decisions based on streaming because there's no real like predictable rule for how things are going to turn out. The thing that we did realize is that loudness is less about your LUFS value once it hits streaming, less about that and more about your mix decisions. Some of the things that we, kind of comparing, we would even do like multiple passes of the mix with different moves. We would do multiple passes of mastering with different moves and just see what happened. Just kind of speaking the loudness side of things, loud compressed master a lot of times does come across very loud on streaming. You're not really getting penalized like people would have you believe. And there are ways to optimize that. There was one we were working on where we put the master in and then had a version where we brought it back a half dB in terms of loudness, half dB, full dB, and compared them. And we realized like the one that was a whole dB quieter, we lost some impact in the way it came across on streaming. But compared to the one that was just at the standard level, there was one that was a half dB quieter, and we noticed that it came across the same exact loudness, but we gained a half dB of peak on it. So it was punchier.
Wow.
So it's just this weird kind of interplay between different factors. So you can kind of experiment around with it if you have the time or interest level to do that. But in terms of hard and fast rules of like what makes something loud and exciting and engaging in a playlist of songs and playlisting, I'll go into that here in a second as well. And this is actually opens up a massive conversation. But the things that make things come across loud and exciting, first thing we noticed was brightness actually. A lot of people be like, you're penalized for brightness in your LUFS measurement. So, don't make things too bright. But we found that brightness and excitement in the top end, actually, when you kind of compare something that's less bright or more bright, the brighter one does still tend to sound more exciting on Spotify than the darker one. And obviously I'm not saying just put a giant shelf on all your stuff to compete on Spotify, but just something we noticed that was a little counterintuitive if you understand LUFS. But the biggest takeaway was the thing that makes things sound loud and exciting on streaming. Number one is making sure your vocal is loud. Vocal, even if you're listening to several different songs, if you hear something with like a crank and vocal, it just always sounds louder on Spotify. So, there's a balance to be had there because at some point, if your vocal's too loud, your music's losing excitement. But the whole idea is having good vocal priority in your mixes really helps things come across exciting on streaming. Another thing was kick and snare levels. It was basically kick, snare, and vocal. If you can have your kick, snare, and your vocal really leading the excitement of a song, pretty much everything else falls into place. And so how that kind of plays into how you're limiting and how loud you're turning things in. There is a point, and it's different in every genre because of like frequency content, like, in like something like this record we're working on, this hardcore record, you're not going to necessarily have like hip hop bass in it, right? And so like a hip hop song, like there's a point where the bass starts disappearing if you limit. You get louder and louder and your bass starts being attenuated and your mix starts becoming more mid-range focused. But in other genres, that can be a little different. So how that plays in the three priorities of vocal, kick, and snare, there is a point of diminishing returns with loudness where if you get so loud that your limiter, clippers, whatever, are crunching down so much on your kick and snare that you start losing excitement in those very important things. And so your song is getting louder and more squashed, but the things that actually make a song sound exciting and punchy and loud on Spotify from like a perceived loudness standpoint are being reduced by that limiter. And so it's all about like in the genre that you're in, finding the appropriate loudness for the important elements, the elements that bring excitement to the song to have the space to punch through and shine in the way that they need to. So
that's amazing.
Wow.
Okay. So when you're talking about those, like the prioritization of like, big vocals, big snare, big drums, right? Or big kick drum.
Right.
I guess how much, when you guys were doing like all these different kind of A/B tests and trying different things, I'm assuming the actual like density of the arrangement also plays a role, but like how much did you explore like the range of arrangement density?
Mm-hmm. We did somewhat, and I'll say this, like, this is where something like streaming preview is really helpful because if you're just comparing, different prints at different loudness. The louder almost always sounds more exciting, but where it becomes very interesting is when you level match them. And that's what the RX streaming preview is doing, is it's level matching, it's normalizing to -14. And so we were kind of dealing in, maybe a maximum of 2 dB differences in our comparisons. And so at that point, especially given the arrangements of the songs and the genre, hardcore things are going to be very dense on a track level. Your guitars are nearing square wave loudness, you know what I mean? And so the density was somewhat baked in, but it was a consideration, but some of that was already baked in. And so I think like the density side of things, it matters for sure. And that's something to be considered. But I would say density isn't always, if you're talking about like 2 dB differences here, density is not always the most important thing, and may be robbing you of your excitement more than adding to it. When you're talking about like a -5 versus a -14 master or something like that, you're going to hear major differences. But in the situation we were in, that was less of a consideration.
How do we know this is exactly how Spotify's algorithm works? First of all, like, did iZotope, get a deal with Spotify? And second of all, this is only when this normalization is on Spotify. This isn't like Spotify doing stuff.
And so I think a big important takeaway from this is don't make decisions based on Spotify. What I'm saying about the kick, snare, vocal, and the things that give you perceived loudness, and some of that has to do with frequency spectrum too. You don't want to have a big old scooped mix, but those considerations apply on any medium, regardless of things being level matched or not. And then kind of to speak to the how do we know, I don't know iZotope's process. I didn't look into it. I probably should. But these findings and the things that we're seeing that iZotope is spitting out corresponds very much with real world tests that have been run. There's Dale Becker, a mastering engineer, he's got a group called Audio Accountability. Sam has also contributed a lot of great information to Dale in that. But the findings and the things that we're seeing coming out of iZotope have been very much confirmed in real world, like comparing, all right, we've got the master in hand and we're comparing it to what is coming out on the other end of Spotify. You can test this, on your own songs. And so the things that we're seeing in RX, for the most part, been very much confirmed in real world examples. So a really interesting point, and you kind of alluded to this, when you're chasing the idea of loudness, you have to consider that, even on Spotify, not all users are hearing a normalized audio. There are people that have it turned off, for instance. There are situations where normalization doesn't apply. I could be wrong on this, but there are certain situations, like in some car situations, Apple CarPlay, stuff like that, or streaming to a Bluetooth device where normalization is not on. And so if you're turning in something that's at -14 trying to game the system, your mix is going to sound so weak in those situations. So you really need to consider all the different factors, which is why I would never advise people to do something to get ahead, quote unquote, on Spotify that would harm the mix in general. You know what I mean? Or the master in general. But it's just kind of keeping all of these different factors in your mind as you approach your loudness and whatnot. And something that I think is really interesting that a lot of people probably aren't aware of is mastering engineers or mix engineers often get into situations where songs released and the client is like, what the heck? My song doesn't sound as loud as this song or whatever. And so one big thing to understand is normalization is based on context. So like if you're playing from your album, your normalization is based on the full record, right? It's not based on that one song. It's based on the context of the full record. Now, if you take that and put it in a playlist with 6 other songs from other artists from different records, all of a sudden your normalization is based on that playlist. If your song is on the New Music Friday playlist, it's normalized based on the context of that playlist. So it is a moving target depending on the context. So
whoa.
It's a big old can of worms, man.
I had no idea. That's crazy. Hey everyone, friend of the podcast and Grammy-nominated engineer/mixer Travis Ferentz hosts Progressions, Success in the Music Industry.
It's a podcast exploring creativity, productivity, and growth in music. Travis has set out to document his own journey and bring those valuable lessons to you to apply to your own career.
Join in each week for conversations with some of the industry's best and brightest about the mindsets and strategies that they use in their careers every day.
Whether you're feeling stuck, digging for inspiration, or just looking for a mix tip, Progressions is probably for you.
Go check it out wherever you get your podcasts or click the link in the show notes.
Have you ever sent a proposal to an artist and they just ghost you? They never respond to it. You had a really great conversation with them. Everything seemed like they were good to go. They wanted to work with you. But then when you send over the proposal with the price on it, they just kind of disappear off into the ether. I'm teaching a free class on how to sell them on the experience of working with you and why that's so special, why you're so special. Don't worry if you can't make it to the live session of the class, because we're going to be recording it so you could replay it at any time whenever you want. It's called the Platinum Pitch, Proposals Clients Can't Refuse. If you want free access to the class, just click the link in the show notes and get registered today. So when it comes to actually observing these tendencies, observing these things that are happening that you're noticing, when it comes time to actually make decisions and to execute things in your mixes and the masters to try to get the most, pleasant loudness that intentional loudness that you can get, I would assume that there are going to be some things that you can do, some choices you make that are going to take a couple steps forward, and there are going to be some things that you do that might take some steps backwards, right? So could you help maybe lay out some of those that you've experimented with or that you've learned about, that either things that might help someone to get a little bit, just a little bit more loudness, or things that people will try to do and it ends up kind of shooting themselves in the foot?
You're just talking in the mix, in mixed land?
So you can say in mixed land. I mean, if you want to get into some mastering examples, that's fine. But I'm just curious, like what you've experienced and how you've been applying these things you've been learning.
Well, I think the big takeaway from that process was that the whole streaming preview thing and all of that is a really helpful tool to understand what's going to happen to your song, but it's really not a guide for how to mix and master. And then kind of going back to how this affects decision making, I think it's really just an overall awareness of, again, like we were talking about, what makes a song sound loud and exciting. And it's also about thinking about the genre you're in. I try to think about loudness less in like, I'm trying to reach this number, and more in the frame of mind of, all right, given the genre that I'm in and the mixed values of this genre, what are the things that are most important in this genre for impact and excitement and enjoyability of the mix? And making my decisions primarily based on that. Like, without a doubt, like anything else is going to be a far second to that consideration. And so I kind of think about loudness in terms of limits, or kind of like guidelines, guardrails, so to speak. I've been trying to kind of develop an understanding of, and again, these numbers they're not the thing that you're going to live and die by. You got to serve the song. But in every genre, in my opinion, there is a range of loudness that is optimal for the genre. I find that in like rock type genres, where you've got a lot of mid-range density, you're naturally going to be louder than other genres in terms of like a LUFS numerical measurement. It's just going to happen because it's so dense. You've got so much consistent mid-range happening because of guitars. But I find in those genres, once you get, if you drop yourself into a chorus and just measure in like a rock song or an alt song, once you get past the -5.5 LUFS point, -5, once you get past that point, you lose more than you gain, and you start losing the ability to create excitement in the most meaningful areas of the music. And kind of zooming out and going to a different genre, I find that with pop and anything that kind of has a sort of kind of hip hop frame to it, where the low end is very important and the low end dynamics are very important, I find that 7.5 kind of becomes the limit for me, where past that point, I start losing low end. I start losing low end dynamic and groove and punch. And, you start smashing your low end and your vocal against the limiter, and you get distortion in your vocal, distortion in your low end. And that can be an intentional decision if that's what you want. But I try to think about it in terms of those limits, like in pop and hip hop, anything that's got a low end and vocal priority. I feel like you really end up kind of shooting yourself in the foot after -7. And again, that's not a hard and fast rule. There are plenty of great sounding mixes in that genre that are louder than that, but it is all context dependent and song dependent. But I think the big thing with mixing in particular and producing, there's the producer rough that precedes the mix, but a lot of times the loudness it kind of happens on accident. It's not an intentional decision, and it can just be like, it just happened, and this is where I'm at, and I'm not even going to check it. Or it could be that the rough came in at -6, and I need to turn it in at -5.5. And that pressure, I think in particular, leads to a lot of subpar, or leads to a lot of mixes that could have been better if the loudness was approached more mindfully and strategically. And I think one of the big things is not being afraid. I mean, the whole I've got to beat the rough thing in loudness is so prevalent. I find myself in that situation all the time. What I've learned over the past year in particular is that is most of the time, 90% of the time, an unneeded pressure on the mix engineer. And what solves that problem is a quick text to the producer or the powers that be, whoever's the person who's responsible for green lighting or, is in the review process of your mixing. If you literally just, we're all on the same team. Hopefully you're communicating with the people you're working with in a way that they know that you're on their team, right? So we're just going to assume that that's the case. If you could just send a text to whoever that person is and say, hey, I noticed the rough came in really loud. I feel like, if we can back that off a little bit, we're going to be able to have a lot more impact in the low end in the drums. We're going to have a lot more space for the vocal. We're going to have a lot more front to back width in the mix. Are you open to me trying that, sending back a pass that is a bit less compressed? And 10 times out of 10, for me so far, the producer or the artist is like, yeah, that sounds great. They're like, I'm sorry, it's super loud. I don't even know why it's that loud. It just kind of happened. How it happens in sessions. And they're like, yeah, please do that. And I've never run into a situation where the mix hasn't been approved because of loudness when I've had that conversation up front. But if they don't know to expect that, they're going to get back something quieter and not understand, why is this quieter? It sounds less exciting. But if you give them that context, and even, a lot of times if there's some hesitancy in that, you can even send them back a level matched rough along with it and be like, kind of just say hey, listen to the difference in how the drums are punching through and so on and so forth. And that can be a helpful learning tool. And I've also found that having that conversation one time leads to a better relationship on the topic of loudness. And even other times I've seen it lead to more mindful practices from maybe the producer on the loudness of the song. So it's my big old blurb on loudness.
Yeah.
But it's a stress point for so many mix engineers and mastering engineers. And I think it's something that is a conversation away from being a very freeing thing and a very creative thing, as opposed to something that is just this demon hanging over the loudness demon hanging over your shoulder, being like, it's not louder than the rough. And also, I've found that when you're in a situation where you're competing against a really loud rough and you're just going with it, I've been in many situations where I'm just frustrated, where I'm like, I can't get this mix to sound like the mix that's in my head. And the second that I pull that fader back, feeding into the mix bus to 3 dB, I'm like, I've got the space to create now. And that's what you want.
I wanted to add on to what you were saying about, having that conversation. And I feel like that's 99% of problems that we tell ourselves that we have when it comes to things like that, they can be solved with a conversation and a text.
Absolutely.
It's absurd how in our own head we get, and how many, I don't want to say imaginary problems we create, but a lot of times, like you said, there are times where the person that did the rough just they just put on a limiter, or I can't tell you how many times, especially with self-producing artists, they would just put on a preset because
100%.
they know they're supposed to do it. And like there was no real thought to it. So chasing after trying to match that is such a doofus way to assume it, you know? And I did want to mention one thing too, is I know what you were saying about sending a level matched version. I know what I've found is when I have that conversation, what I'll do is I'll send them just like a snippet of the song. Because I feel like if I have to make them go from the beginning to the end, especially if they're overcompressed, then their, quiet intro is going to seem louder right away.
So loud, yeah.
First one's so loud. So if I just take, hey, here's chorus 1, old version, my version, like level matched. And it's really hard not to do a better job, and it's really hard not to convince them, especially when a lot of times when it comes to that impressiveness, even just like a little bit of thoughtful stereo imaging can do the trick too. It's not always just how loud it is, but also if their rough is just kind of narrow and flat and a little boring, like 3% on, like an ozone imager opens everything up. And even if the numbers are the same, it feels so much more impressive. So there are even little ways like that you can get around it.
Yeah, and the conversation and that intention builds trust too, because they know that you're not motivated primarily by getting it across the line. You're motivated by the integrity of the music.
Yeah, who could say no to the integrity of the music, right?
That's right.
You're talking from the mixing perspective, right? But then you're still sending it off to Sam, let's say, for mastering, and like, how much room are you still leaving him to get it to those kind of levels that you're envisioning in terms of those? I think last time we spoke, you told me you kind of just like you send it how loud you think it should be with the limiter, and then the mastering engineer does or doesn't just deals with that basically, if I recall correctly. Is that still what you're doing? Are you giving Sam some wiggle room? Let's say, like what do you expect? What do you expect there to be there?
Well, first thing is I mix in a way, and a lot of people do this, I'm not unique in this, but a lot of people mix in a way, I mix in a way where I'm not leaving anything for mastering. Like I'm not thinking, oh, mastering is going to take care of XYZ. I'm just pretending like mastering doesn't exist. I love mastering, so don't get me wrong on that. But it's just the way, I just want to deliver a complete finished product. And then when it comes to delivering the mastering, I'm going to send them my ref that is at the level that I think is great. Then I'm also going to send them another print where I'm backing off the final limiter by 3 dB. So sometimes, if the limiter's got room on the slider to bring it back 3 dB, I'll do that, or I'll just put a trim plug in before the limiter so that there's room, possibly to create that loudness or density in a better way using the approach or the mindset they have. Also, it allows for more tonal changes. Like if, we want more low end in this, if you're working off of something that doesn't have any room, you can't really do that. And so it allows room for tonal changes if need be. But yeah, just gives them freedom to work. So some people choose to work off of that -3. Other people choose to work off of the approved reference mix. And that's totally up to them.
And so I guess they're having the same sort of conversations.
Of course, yeah. And there are times where, even with our best laid plans and our intention, where sometimes it gets a little loud and it's robbing the song of some level of musicality that's important to the song. And I always let my mastering engineers, the folks I work with, know that I'm okay if they turn back something that is slightly more dynamic. Like, that's fine. Like, we're all trying to find the best version of this mix and song as we can. So
I love that. Yeah. So good.
That's amazing. And I love the fact that you have, I don't say like your MO, but like a very central part of your process is keeping the communication lines open, not just between you and the producer or the artist or the mastering engineer, but kind of like everybody, and always just trying to make sure that everybody is working in tandem towards the same goal, even if that goal takes slightly different shapes as you're going.
Absolutely.
So I think this is, unless you disagree, Ben, I feel like this is a really good point to maybe
pivot into the next episode,
part of the episode up, because I've got some get into the next episode because I've got some follow-ups about your collective nerditude that you and Sam have been kind of like diving in together going into this. And I'd really love to hear about, what your process of the collective learning with a team is like, and kind of how you approach actually, not just being on the same page for individual projects, but since you've been working together for so long, how does that relationship look, and how does this, this collective parallel education, how does that really like play out? So I'd love to talk about that in the next episode.
Let's do it.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did. If anything here resonated with you, please share this or your favorite episode with a friend.
And as always, we love to hear from our listeners. So find us on social media at Secret Sonics,
at Ben Wallach Music,
and at Carl Bonner. Until next time, bye, Ben.
Bye, Carl. That was good. I think the outro was great.